Henry VIII, King of England, was not permitted to put on his own shirt. This was not a matter of habit or convenience. It was written into law, into a formal set of household rules drawn up in 1526, which stated plainly that no servant, however senior, was allowed to lay a hand on the king's body to dress him, except for a small, named group of men who held that single right above everyone else in the kingdom. So how did the most powerful man in England actually begin his day? And who controlled every part of it before he had even left his bed? The rules that decided all of this were drawn up in January 1526 at Eltham Palace on the orders of Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, the king's closest advisor at the time. The official reason given was financial. The royal household had grown past 700 people, and the cost of feeding, housing, and moving that many men and women around the country had climbed past £20,000 a year, an enormous sum at the time, at a moment when England was also paying for wars abroad. Wolsey's solution was to write down, in exact detail, who was allowed to do what and when inside the king's private rooms, covering everything down to how leftover candle wax was supposed to be collected and accounted for, rather than quietly taken home by servants. Many of the men who lost their informal access to the king under these new rules resented it deeply, and within months, several of them had quietly found their way back into favor, regardless of what the written rules said. The document itself survived, however, and it remains one of the clearest surviving records of exactly how a king's morning was supposed to run. Across the rest of the palace, the ordinary work of the morning had already begun well before that. Servants moved through the public rooms, lighting fires, carrying water up from the kitchens, and sweeping the floor of the great hall ahead of the first meal to be served there. None of this work depended on whether the king himself had woken yet. It ran on its own separate schedule, keeping the building functioning regardless of what time he eventually opened his eyes, and the men and women doing it had no expectation of ever being seen by him at all. Inside his own rooms, the same household rules fixed an exact timetable for the men who served his bedchamber directly. The pages were ordered to rise at 7 each morning, build up the fire, and then wake the esquires of the body, who in turn had to be standing in the king's chamber, fully dressed themselves, by 8 o'clock at the very latest. None of their own servants were allowed to step inside that room. They could only wait at the door, ready to fetch or carry away whatever the esquires needed. The 6 gentlemen of the privy chamber, the only men of rank trusted this close to the king, were held to an even tighter schedule. They had to be standing inside the chamber by 7 o'clock, or earlier still, depending on what hour the king himself had decided the night before he intended to rise. In practice, this meant Henry set the time of his own waking in advance, and an entire layer of his household rearranged itself around that single decision before dawn. In his later years, he preferred to rise nearer 8 in the morning, considerably later than almost everyone else under his roof, who were already up and working by candlelight or first light several hours earlier. This single detail says something about how rank worked inside the palace. The lowest servants in the building, the men who lit fires and carried water, were awake first. The king, at the very top of that same household, was awake last. Waking early was not a sign of importance at Hampton Court. It was the opposite. Once the king stirred, an esquire of the body entered the bedchamber to begin the process, putting him into clean linen, a shirt, and a pair of drawers, kept folded in one of 2 large chests inside the room. The first chest held linen freshly washed and laid with dried herbs to keep it sweet. The second held the linen he had already worn, set aside until it could be collected by his laundress. Any other garment the esquires needed that morning was handed to them through the bedchamber door by a groom who was not permitted to enter the room himself under any circumstances. Once the king was loosely dressed in this first layer, he moved through into the adjoining privy chamber, and it was here that his 6 gentlemen finished the work, fastening him into the doublet, then the jerkin worn over it, and finally, the gown that completed the outfit for the day. The household rules were specific on this point. None of the grooms or ushers standing nearby were allowed to touch the king's body or assist with any part of his dressing, on pain of losing their position, unless Henry himself gave a direct order otherwise. Warming the clothes by the fire or passing them across the room was permitted. Actually placing them on the king's body was not, unless you were one of the 6. Among the 6 gentlemen, one held a position more intimate than any of the others, the groom of the stool, originally responsible for nothing more than attending the king during his most private bodily moments, including his use of the close stool itself. It was, on paper, the least dignified job at court. In practice, it became one of the most envied, since whoever held it spent more unwitnessed hours alone with the king than almost any other person alive, and several men who held the post went on to gain real and lasting influence over royal finances simply through that closeness. The same set of rules bound all 6 gentlemen to a strict code of silence about anything that happened inside that room, ordering them to remain on close and friendly terms with one another, and never to repeat, to anyone who had not been present at the time, what had been said or done in the king's company. For this work, a gentleman of the privy chamber was paid £50 a year, a gentleman usher 30, and a groom 20, modest figures set against the wealth passing daily through the room they guarded, but enough to make the appointments fiercely competed for among the sons of noble families, some of whom waited years for the chance. The clothes themselves arrived from one floor below. A narrow spiral staircase connected the king's bedchamber directly down to the office of the wardrobe, where his garments were stored, and every morning without exception, a servant climbed those stairs carrying the day's chosen pieces up to the gentleman waiting at the top. The linen against his skin was of a finer grade than almost anyone else in England could obtain, some of it embroidered along the cuffs and collar with gold or silver thread, embroidery so valuable that it had to be carefully unpicked before the garment could be washed to stop the thread from tarnishing in the water. His outer clothes, by contrast, were rarely washed at all. They were simply brushed or sponged clean, since the linen lining sewn inside each one did the real work of staying next to his body. Color itself was a controlled substance at court. By law, purple could be worn by no one in England except the king and his immediate family, regardless of how much money anyone else had to spend on dye. Henry's own preference ran instead to red, to gold, and to black, the 3 colors that appear again and again in his portraits. And clothing that had once belonged to the king did not simply disappear once he tired of it. He would pass garments on to his favored gentlemen, who in turn handed them down again to their own servants, so that a single doublet might travel through 3 or 4 different ranks of society on its way to finally wearing out. While the dressing was underway, the king's barber waited in the same privy chamber with everything already laid out: water, cloths, razors, combs, and scissors, ready to trim the head and beard the moment the gentlemen had finished their part. The household rules covered him directly as well, ordering him to keep his own body and clothing scrupulously clean at all times and to avoid the company of disreputable people, on the stated reasoning that whatever touched him might, by extension, touch the king. Failing in this was grounds for losing the position outright, along with whatever further punishment the king decided on. Along with the 6 gentlemen, the barber was effectively one of the only people in England with standing permission to place a blade close to the king's throat and a hand on his face. Washing came next, and here Hampton Court offered something almost no other house in the country had at the time: a bathroom supplied with hot running water, built specifically for the king's private use, most likely intended for after exercise rather than first thing every single morning. For most people in this period, even wealthy ones, a daily wash meant scrubbing the body through a worn linen shirt rather than removing every garment at once, since undressing completely struck most 16th century minds as unwise rather than simply unnecessary. A basin, a jug of warmed water, and a cloth scented with rose or lavender were standard fixtures of any privy chamber, the king's included, regardless of whether the grander bathroom down the corridor was in use that particular day. Even the linen that had touched his body during the night did not pass out of the palace unaccounted for. It went to a single named laundress, paid a fixed yearly wage and required to supply her own soap, who washed it using a mixture of wood ash lye and aged urine, the latter valued specifically for its bleaching properties once left to stand for several days. The smell faded entirely during that process, and the linen was then dried, where possible, draped over rosemary or lavender bushes outdoors, the plants holding the fabric in place while passing their scent into it. Clean white linen was at the time a visible sign of wealth in its own right. The whiter the cloth, the more bleaching it had been able to afford, and the king's was kept whiter than almost anyone's. Dressed, groomed, and washed, the king did not step out into an empty room. The entire layout of Hampton Court had been built around the idea that almost nobody should be allowed anywhere near him. A visitor entering the palace passed through a sequence of rooms, each one more restricted than the last. First the Great Hall, open to several hundred people at once, then the Great Watching Chamber, guarded by the king's own bodyguard, the yeoman of the guard, whose job was simply to control who passed beyond that point. Then the Presence Chamber, his official throne room, used for anyone granted a formal audience. And only past all of that, the Privy Chamber and the Bedchamber itself, reached by a very small number of named individuals, with as many as 1,000 people attached to the household whenever the king was in residence. The great majority of them never once stood in the same room as the man they served, and some courtiers spent years at Hampton Court chasing nothing more than a single moment of being noticed by him in passing. The moment Henry walked out of his privy chamber fully dressed, he stepped directly into a crowd of courtiers and petitioners who had already been waiting outside that door, in some cases since well before dawn, each one hoping for a glance, a word, or the chance to press a letter into the right hand. From there, he walked in procession toward the Chapel Royal to hear morning mass, moving along an upper gallery that connected his private rooms to the chapel itself. This was one of the few moments in the day when people who otherwise had no business near the king, clerks, lesser officials, visiting petitioners, might catch sight of him at all, even briefly, as the procession passed. Attendance at Mass was not treated as optional for an English king in this period. It came before any other business of the day, however urgent that business happened to be, and the route he walked to get there later became one of the most discussed corridors in the entire palace, long after his reign had ended. Once rumors attached themselves to it concerning one of his later wives. A light meal followed Mass, taken in private. This broke with older custom rather than following it. Before the 16th century it had not been usual to eat anything at all immediately on rising, with the first proper meal of the day generally saved for somewhere between 10:30 and noon. Around 400 courtiers and staff attached to Henry's household held the formal right to 2 meals a day. The first served at 10 each morning, divided strictly along lines of rank between 2 different rooms, the senior men eating in the Great Watching Chamber and everyone of lesser standing eating in the Great Hall below it. The king himself ate apart from all of them, his food prepared in a separate private kitchen by his own master cook, a Frenchman named John Bricket, working independently of the 200 kitchen staff feeding the rest of the court that same morning. Where the wider household ate from dishes allotted according to fixed rank, his were chosen for him specifically, and a typical breakfast tray for the king could include manchet, the finest white wheat bread available, alongside cheat bread, a coarser brown loaf meant for dipping into broth together with beer and wine, a thick meat pottage, beef venison prepared in a rich sauce, and young veal, served while he sat largely on his own. Government business, in theory, started shortly after this. The King's Privy Council generally met around midday in a council chamber that Henry had built specifically for the purpose between 1528 and 1530, soon after taking Hampton Court for himself. Men such as Charles Brandon, his close friend since childhood, and later Thomas Cromwell, sat in that room and discussed matters of state that went on to shape the country for generations afterward, debated behind a guarded door that almost none of the 1,000 people elsewhere in the palace would ever be allowed to open. In his younger years, however, Henry frequently refused to involve himself in any of it until he had hunted first, leaving the actual running of government largely to his ministers. He also disliked reading long letters, to the point that officials at court learned, as a matter of basic survival, to keep their written reports to him as short as they possibly could. Foreign ambassadors and ordinary petitioners, meanwhile, were left waiting in the presence chamber for the rare chance of being noticed at all. Reaching the king directly, without first going through a minister, was for most of them simply not possible, and those who did manage even a brief audience often wrote detailed accounts of his appearance and mood back to their own governments afterward, since so few outsiders ever had the chance to observe him this closely. What Henry generally wanted to do with the rest of his morning was leave the palace altogether. In 1529, almost as soon as he had taken Hampton Court from Cardinal Wolsey, he turned the surrounding land into a private deer park covering well over 1,000 acres, an area that includes what is known today as Bushy Park and Home Park. Red and fallow deer were kept there specifically for him to hunt, driven toward him by hounds or, on other days, tracked and shot from a distance. It was not always a smooth sport. On at least one recorded occasion, he killed a deer that turned out not to belong to the royal herd at all, and had to personally compensate the animal's actual owner afterward. Ordinary subjects who tried the same thing without royal permission faced far harsher consequences, since the laws protecting royal deer carried serious financial and physical penalties for anyone caught poaching them. On mornings when he chose neither hunting nor tennis, fishing was a further option close at hand. More than once he is recorded taking a simple angle rod down to the Thames near the palace, fishing the river himself rather than leaving it entirely to the servants whose job that normally was. On days he preferred not to hunt, there was an alternative directly within the palace walls. Henry had commissioned the first real tennis court at Hampton Court in 1528, and by every account he took the game seriously. While actually playing, he stripped down to his linen drawers and a pair of soft shoes, then put on a velvet coat afterward in black or blue, specifically to avoid catching a chill once he had stopped moving and begun to cool down. A dedicated court official, the keeper of tennis plays, restrung his rackets with sheep gut and kept score during matches, and on days the king was not using the court, his courtiers could hire it themselves for a fixed daily rate. Gambling on the outcome of these games was common practice among the men who watched, despite occasional grumbling at court that tennis was as dangerous to a man's purse as to his body. A Venetian ambassador who once watched him play later reported home that he had rarely seen anyone move so well on a tennis court, his skin visible faintly through the fine linen of his shirt as he played. By mid-morning, somewhere between 10 and 11, the day's main meal was served, the one contemporaries simply called dinner, eaten far earlier than later centuries would consider normal for a midday meal. On an ordinary day, it might run to 5 or 6 separate courses. On a more significant occasion, it could stretch to 9 or 10, with elaborate sugar sculptures known as subtleties, sometimes brought out between courses on the grandest days, shaped into castles, animals, or coats of arms, intended as much to be admired and discussed as to be eaten. The kitchens supporting all of this operated on a scale that is difficult to picture today. In a typical year, the royal table accounted for well over 1,000 oxen, more than 8,000 sheep, upwards of 2,000 deer, hundreds of calves and pigs, dozens of wild boar, and several 100,000 gallons of beer, all of it managed by a kitchen staff of roughly 200 people, working across more than 50 separate rooms built specifically for food preparation. The king's own portion, smaller in scale but far more closely controlled, was tasted before it ever reached him, and carried in by gentlemen whose entire role at court was simply to serve at his table, frequently set beneath a canopy that marked his rank even on ordinary days when no formal court occasion was taking place. By the time that meal ended, the morning that had begun with a small group of named men standing silently in an empty chamber before 7 o'clock, waiting for a king who had not yet opened his eyes, had grown into the full operation of one of the largest royal households in Europe, somewhere close to 1,000 people, each one assigned a specific task, almost all of it built, in one way or another, around a single question: what would the king require next? Most of those people would go home that evening, or to their lodgings within the palace walls, having spent the entire morning supporting a routine they would never personally witness in full, dressing linen they would never wear, cooking dishes they would never taste, and guarding doors they themselves were not permitted to pass through. The king, for his part, had simply lived through the version of a morning that had been built for him since the day he was crowned, one in which almost nothing, from the shirt against his skin to the deer driven toward his bow, was left for him to arrange himself.